Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting in 2024 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Willie Coffey and Mark Griffin are joining us online today. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. And the first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are members agreed? We're all agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman. The committee will be hearing from the Ombudsman at its meeting on the 10th of December. To inform that session, the committee has issued a call for views. And drawing on the responses to that call for views, the committee will be hearing from 2 panels of witnesses today. On the first panel, we are joined for this item by Professor Chris Gill, who is a Professor of Socio-Legal Studies, and Professor Tom Mullen, who is a Professor of Law at the University of Glasgow. And I welcome you both to the meeting. There's no need for you to turn your microphones on and off. We'll do that for you. I've got an initial number of questions, and then I'll be bringing in members with other questions. The nature of my first question is around achievement and evidence that supports the view. So SPSO achievement. So the SPSO was set up in 2002 to provide a public sector complaint system which is open, accountable, easily accessible to all, and has the trust of the Scottish public. And I'd be interested to hear from your perspective whether you think that this has been achieved and what your evidence would be to support that view. And maybe I'll start with Chris and then go to Tom.
Thank you. So obviously these assessments can be quite difficult to make because some of those aims that you have just outlined are very broad-based aims, and they're things that can be quite difficult to assess. What I would say is I think, generally speaking, in terms of the academic consensus, the setup and operation of the SPSO is seen as a success. There were some various features of the scheme in its inception that have been copied in other jurisdictions around the UK. So, for example, I think particularly effective has been the idea of having a one-stop shop for complaints, bringing together an ombudsman with broad jurisdiction over all public services. And from then on, really, I think some of the developments in the ombudsman's jurisdiction have been seen quite positively in relation to ombudsman practice in other jurisdictions. So the Complaint Standards Authority function in particular has been seen as a development which is innovative and which has now been widely copied throughout other jurisdictions of the UK. One of the issues that we have, I think, in relation to all ombudsmen isn't just in relation to the SPSO, is in relation to the evidence base that we have for making some of these assessments. We have information that's published by the ombudsman herself, which is often very helpful and useful, but it only goes so far, really, in terms of allowing us to make assessments around, for example, quality or trustworthiness. We don't really know, for example, if the Ombudsman is a trusted institution in the sense that that would require sort of wide-scale survey work, which we simply haven't done and don't have access to. I think there's some improvements that the Ombudsman herself could make to the data that is published and available for scrutiny of yourselves, but also academics. But at the same time, some of the information that would allow us to make these assessments simply isn't possible because it would require relatively extensive primary research. So I suppose our judgments are made based on publicly available information and kind of experts' judgments. And I think to that extent, broadly speaking, I would say the establishment of the SPSO and the way it's been operating has been successful. There are certainly some areas which we can go into where there are potential for improvements.
Yep. We've got some more questions that we can get there. Tom, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Chris has given us an excellent overview, and I think I'll wait till we get into the more specific questions before I add anything.
Okay, thanks very much. My next question, your submission states that the Ombudsman has an important role in helping public service improve their service provision. And given the near record level of public service complaints received by the SPSO last year, I'd be interested to hear from you what evidence there is that the Ombudsman is actually helping to improve public services.
Well, I'll maybe start
and
pass on to Chris. Just to reiterate the point that Chris made about the limitations of the information that we have available, one certainly could look at the statistics about complaints, the numbers of complaints, the numbers that are investigated, the rates at which complaints are being upheld, and that would indicate the Ombudsman is making a real contribution to detecting, sound, good complaints, upholding them, and recommending remedies. Whether the level of complaints, although it's very high, is a clear reflection of how much maladministration there is in the public sector, one can't find that out just in the level of complaints. But yeah, certainly the Ombudsman making a contribution in terms of resolving individual complaints. When it gets to the broader aim of going beyond the individual complaint to perhaps finding out if there are systemic flaws, in particular areas of public administration, and suggesting ways of improving systemically for the future. Again, there is some evidence, because if you look at the Ombudsman reports, you can see information about when they have made recommendations of a more wide-reaching nature in particular cases. So some of that information appears in reports in relation to particular examples, but we don't have enough information, I think, to provide an overview about how well that broader function of achieving systemic improvement is actually being performed. I think we would need to do research which is actually sort of going into the public authorities themselves and seeing how they have responded when a systemic improvement suggestion is made.
Yeah, and just to completely agree with what Tom's just said, and just add to that, there has been some small-scale research done in Scotland recently looking at the impact of the SPSO on health boards, and this research was doing a comparison between sort of Scotland and Australia in this regard, and what it found was that in general the SPSO's recommendations are accepted and they are acted upon by health boards. Having said that, it tends to be in a rather minimalist and grudging fashion. So part of what that research kind of found was that the potential for sort of wider learning, especially around kind of culture and perhaps adopting, I suppose the spirit of what the Ombudsman would like to see, as well as the kind of letter of recommendations, was perhaps not happening as much. So there is a limited evidence, but it's small-scale research that doesn't provide the kind of data that I think Tom was just saying would be really useful.
Okay, so you're suggesting that maybe we need to think more about looking for opportunities to do more of that kind of research. And when you just to clarify, when you say grudging nature, so there's a recommendation from what I understand is a recommendation to the health board from the SPSO around a remedy, and it's not accepted in a kind of welcoming arms or something.
I think that's right. So that's what this particular bit of research found, that there would be compliance, but it would be in a sort of fairly minimal way. So rather than sort of seeking to really look at the issues and think, okay, because for example, when any recommendation is made, you could look at it quite narrowly in terms of, okay, well, we need to give training to this particular group of people. But perhaps a broader approach might be to say, well, actually, this seems to be suggesting a wider issue, which requires something much bigger to be done. And I think the health boards in this study were not doing that. They were looking at it in a fairly minimalist sense. They also, I think, perceived their relationship with the Ombudsman as one that was quite adversarial. So rather than having these sort of more cooperative, perhaps open relationships of learning, they were seeing it very much as the Ombudsman being about accountability. And the suggestion of this particular piece of research was that it's very difficult to do both. If you're focused on accountability, it can be hard to bring people along the learning journey with you. If you're focused on learning, maybe bringing out that accountability can be more difficult.
I wonder also if there's an aspect of capacity within the health board to really kind of, they're already kind of like stretched, and then, oh, we're going to have to take on learning, or we're going to have to look at this in a broader way, and we feel that we don't have that capacity.
Yeah. I think almost inevitably, I mean, I think with public services being stretched, I think responding to Ombudsman recommendations is going to be something that is a challenge. So capacity and resources, I think, is always an underlying issue whenever we're discussing complaints and any issues to do with the Ombudsman.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey, who's joining us online. He's got a number of questions for you. Willie.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Professor Gill, Professor Mullen. I wanted to ask you about the new obligations, new duties that the Ombudsman has taken on board, or been given, rather. and you refer to it as considerable institutional experimentation with the addition of the welfare fund and being the national whistleblowing officer for the NHS. Firstly, when that sort of thing happens, where does the Ombudsman draw its expertise from in order to take on board that widening scope of investigation?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely striking the extent to which the SPSO's functions have become diversified. All of the public sector ombudsmen in the UK share the same sort of two basic functions, one of which is to redress individual complaints, and the second is to use complaints as a window into possible wider systemic problems and leading to improvement. But what the SPSO has done is to add additional functions like the review of the Scottish Welfare Fund, being the Complaint Standards Authority and the whistleblowing role. So it's a more complex mix of functions. I think so far I don't think we have positive indications that it has been problematic, but it might become problematic in the future to, as it were, maintain effective performance over this range of sometimes quite different functions. I think the extra function I would definitely call attention to as possibly problematic in future is the Scottish Welfare Fund. Now that's a corner of the social security system. It's one of the ones that's devolved. People may remember there used to be something called the Social Fund, which was part of the UK social security system, which gave people additional grant and loan payments to help them over short-term difficulties. And that money has been folded into the Scottish Welfare Fund. So the decisions that we made are effectively about social security benefit. It's the sort of thing that historically would have been sent to an independent tribunal for a binding decision, but it's been given to the Ombudsman instead. And I think primarily that was simply because at the time there was a desire in government not to create another new public body like a tribunal, and the Ombudsman was there for a convenient place to send it. But I think we would not want to see the Ombudsman become a repository for grievance resolution processes that the government thinks there's nowhere else for them to go. It should be able to focus on its principal functions. So I would not support an extension of that type of review mechanism. And I think the other important point about the review mechanism is that it does result in a binding decision by the Ombudsman, which contradicts one of the basic principles of Ombudsman, which is that they make recommendations and not binding decisions. Why do they make recommendations and not binding decisions? Well, that goes back to the point Chris made about seeking a cooperative rather than an adversarial relationship with the public bodies they supervise. Because back in 1967, when the first legislation was enacted at UK level, the choice was made not to have binding decisions because it would felt that would make it too adversarial. Chris, do you want to add anything?
No, that's...
Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for the answer to that. And so you're basically saying that there isn't any real noticeable impact on, positive or otherwise, of these additional burdens being carried out by the Ombudsman Service. I wanted to ask that, but I think you mentioned that in your response there. Maybe turning to budgets and financing and so on, your submission also was given as an indication, of course, that we need to properly support and fund the Ombudsman Service to perform its role effectively. We know that, and we know about the significant pressures on public finances at the moment. So with a budget of £6.7 million a year, how does that generally compare with other comparable Ombudsman services that we know of? And is that a sufficient level of funding for the service to carry out its duties and albeit expanded to that degree that we mentioned a moment ago?
So I don't have the figures on me in terms of the budgets of the other UK Ombudsmen, but what I would say is that it's very difficult to draw those kinds of comparisons because of the different remits that the Ombudsman has. So we just talked about two functions in Scotland that just simply aren't replicated in any of the other jurisdictions. No one has the Scottish Welfare Fund jurisdiction or a whistleblowing jurisdiction. Other jurisdictions have got additional functions that don't exist in Scotland or aren't given to the Ombudsman. So in Wales and in Northern Ireland, there's a standards jurisdiction where the Ombudsman is also the standards commissioner, effectively, and will look at breaches of the code of practice for elected members. So this means that comparisons are very, very difficult to make across jurisdictions. There's also differences in terms of volumes of complaint and so on, which means that just comparing budgets is not really a particularly helpful approach. There is no research or no real understanding of what the optimal cost per case of an ombudsman might be, what their ultimate budget should be. These are all very, very difficult questions, which sadly no one has come up with particularly good answers to so far. So I think really the way to assess the quality of what an ombudsman's doing, their value for money, is through kind of qualitative types of assessment, like the ones that your committee does every year when you're reviewing the ombudsman. What I would say is that there's a possibility of going beyond that. I think we're probably never going to get the empirical evidence that Tom and I as researchers would like to have, because it would cost too much money to get that evidence, and not enough people probably would be interested in it. But what we can do, I think, is have expert judgments. So, for example, one of the proposals in our submission was around having a regular independent review of the Ombudsman conducted by independent, objective experts. And they might be able to do a bit of a halfway house, being able to research some issues in more depth than this committee, for example, is able to do, and at the same time not going to that sort of full-blown kind of academic research. So I think improving that evidence base would be key, and that would allow you to make some of those judgments. What I would do is kind of caution against saying, well, what this ombudsman is doing seems to be much cheaper, for example, because making those assessments, I think, are just very, very problematic.
Thanks for that, Professor Gill. We'll just turn to the complaints model at SAIL that was introduced in 2011. And since that time, of course, the number of complaints has steadily risen. What's the evidence that the approach of bringing in that model has been working? Is that what we would naturally expect from introducing a new model for complaints handling, for the complaints to actually increase? Is that what we should expect to happen?
So I think it's a difficult question to say whether we should expect that. I would say it's probably not surprising. I mean, if you have complaint systems which are simplified, then you have to remember that prior to the Public Bodies Act, a lot of complaint systems in parts of the Scottish public service were extremely complicated. You could have complaints process that had 6 internal stages before you could reach the Ombudsman. And what we've moved to now is a very, I think, truncated and efficient model where you have 5 days to try and informally resolve something, and then 20 days to provide a final decision. Now, it seems inevitable that with that sort of truncated process, you're more likely to allow easy access to the Ombudsman than under a process which really effectively buried complaints under 6 levels of internal process. So to me, it's not entirely surprising that you would see a greater number of complaints reaching the SPSO because that underlying process has been made more efficient. So that, to me, is a sign that certainly from an efficiency perspective, the throughput of complaints through to the Ombudsman is kind of working. In terms of whether that's being done well, and in terms of whether complaint handling has improved in terms of its quality at that kind of local level within public bodies, it's more difficult to say. Certainly, if you look at the SPSO's own statistics, most of the reason why investigations or full investigations don't happen is because they're satisfied with the quality of the complaint handling that has taken place at the earlier stage. So I think something like 50% of cases that are closed prior to investigation are closed on the basis that the initial complaint handling has been of good quality. So again, these are indicators that there have been improvements in relation to how public service complaints are being dealt with. And again, I wouldn't rely on an increase in number of complaints to the SPSO to be saying that's a sign that the Ombudsman system hasn't been working and that the Complaint Standards Authority model has been ineffective. I think it would be quite helpful, again, to do a bit more research to evaluate how the CSA has worked in practice, but certainly on the face of it, there's nothing to indicate a huge issue there.
I think we might come to that question a bit later on in the questioning, Professor Gill, but thank you very much for answering those questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Willie. We're going to stay online and go to questions from Mark Griffin. And Mark, if you can just take all of your questions in one go, that would be great. I mean, in your time.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. I won't ask you all in one go. You'll be glad to know. just wanted to ask a question about neutrality or perceived neutrality. We've received some submissions from people who are frustrated as what they perceive as a relationship between the Ombudsman and public bodies that are too close. So just wanted to ask if you feel that the SPSO is adequately independent from the public bodies they're assessing complaints about, and are you concerned about that people appear to be doubting the neutrality of the Ombudsman?
Excuse me, I think it certainly is a matter of concern if there's a doubt about neutrality, because the perception of independence and neutrality is absolutely key to the public trusting the Ombudsman. And if there is a serious level of distrust about neutrality, it's going to put people off making complaints. I think I and most researchers would agree that there actually isn't any evidence that there is a problem of partiality towards public bodies. I think all the evidence suggests that Ombudsmen do maintain the appropriate level of neutrality in dealing with complaints, and that they will therefore uphold a complaint where the evidence suggests that the complaint is well founded. So I'm not entirely sure where these perceptions of a lack of neutrality come from. I don't really think there's anything objectively to support them. But if I could add just one point on the question of neutrality, if the Ombudsman was partial, that in theory could go either way. They could be partial towards the public bodies, or they could be partial towards complainants. And as I say, I don't think they are either of these things. But there is obviously a sense in which the Ombudsman is assisting the complainant to a degree, because the person makes the complaint and it's then up to the Ombudsman to investigate it and to lead the complaint. So in that sense, the Ombudsman is investigating the complaint on the complainant's behalf, rather than relying on the complainant to find out the facts, or the representative of the complainant to find out the facts. And so they do have to balance their roles. They have to be aware that they are trying to do justice for the complainant without leaning too far towards the complainant's side. But in terms of being partial towards public authorities, no, I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Okay, thank you. You talked about being concerned about some of the long waiting times for complaints to be considered, and the impact that those waiting times have in terms of potentially reducing trust and satisfaction of members of the public. And I just wonder if you're aware of any research looking at how performance of the Ombudsman, time taken to look at complaints, then impact on public trust in the complaint system as a whole.
So I don't think we have any research evidence on that. What we do know is that complaints generally, there's been a lot of complaints research that suggests that timeliness is a kind of key criteria that people are looking for. So it's the whole sort of justice delayed is justice denied type of idea, that if people are having to wait a very long time in order to actually have resolutions to their complaints, then inevitably that has a knock-on effect on their satisfaction with the process. So they expect responsive, relatively quick outcomes, and that I think is key to kind of customer expectations. If they're not being met, then clearly that has, I think, a knock-on impact in terms of sort of how the whole system is being perceived. There's also been, I think, quite long-standing concerns in the literature with the time it takes for ombudsmen to investigate issues. So timeliness has been a kind of long-standing critique of where ombudsmen are, that they should be quicker and more responsive. And I think ombudsmen in general have moved in that direction. So obviously there's a backlog at the moment with the SPSO, but if you look at the way it's changed its processes over time, a lot of its casework is now dealt with at a stage prior to investigation. So they're trying to reach what they call perhaps informal resolutions or early resolutions, trying to settle cases without the need of going to a full investigation with a full public report. that has been driven by an attempt to be responsive to concerns around delay, around speed, around responsiveness. Now, of course, at the same time, the Ombudsman is then criticised for not investigating enough and for not using enough of its kind of more lengthy inquisitorial processes on a sufficient number of cases. So there's an element of the Ombudsman always being between a sort of rock and a hard place, both between complainants and public bodies, but also having these very potentially requirements that effectively are pulling in different directions, one towards speed and one towards using very expensive, lengthy processes. I think, probably on the whole, the balance where the Ombudsman is at the moment seems about right. Very difficult, again, to make those judgments. In terms of the backlog, however, I think that is a problem. I think if you're told that, it's going to be 4 months until your case can even be looked at, then I think that's 4 months that you're sort of waiting there with an issue that's unresolved, becoming increasingly unhappy that nothing is happening. So I think that's a problem for the Ombudsman, and there's a problem in terms of the sort of long-term ability to convince citizens that it's a responsive institution that's there for them. So I think the backlog does need to be addressed as a matter of priority.
Thanks. And finally, just on performance indicators, you've said that they appear to be rather limited and narrow in scope, and few or no indicators relating to quality and customer satisfaction. And I just wonder what your view is on how the SPSO or any potential external reviewer would go about measuring and monitoring these areas, and any recommendation for inclusion of further performance indicators.
So I think on customer satisfaction, it used to be the case that there were sort of fairly regular customer surveys done of the SPSO's complainants. Going back quite a long way, those used to be done independently by a sort of independent research consultancy. And I think that's probably the kind of gold standard in terms of the approach, because it's partly about ensuring that kind of independence and sort of showing to people that this is independent research whose results can be relied on. My understanding is that the Ombudsman then moved to kind of do this research in-house. And I'm not sure if it's still ongoing. What I can see is that I don't see the results being published any longer. So I think that looking at that piece and thinking a little bit about how customer satisfaction data is being collected, how it's being published, and linking that to a key performance indicator around customer satisfaction would all be things that would be very beneficial. In relation to quality assurance, again, there used to be more information published about the results of the internal quality assurance processes undertaken by the Ombudsman. It doesn't look like that information is published any longer. There's a sort of very short abstract provided in the annual report. But again, I think if you look at some other Ombudsmen around the UK, they will actually have some relatively clear KPIs around what the results of quality assurance processes should be. Now, I think that's the kind of information that would allow yourselves and also ourselves as academics to kind of be able to reach some more balanced judgments. If the kind of methodologies for customer service or quality assurance processes were in the public domain, if the results of those were in the public domain, then I think it would be easier to suggest that actually overall processes are working effectively. At the moment, it's very difficult to reach that as a sort of absolute assessment. And then when we have things like disappointed complainants who have had very difficult experiences, it's hard to know what to make of those, because are they just individual aberrations, or are they evidence of some kind of more systemic problem with how the Ombudsman's operated? It's very difficult to reach those judgments.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks very much. Just before I bring Alexander Stewart in, I just wanted to pick up this. So in your submission, you state that the complaint standards function is a net benefit for Ombudsman institutions, but I'd be interested to understand if you have a sense of whether it's benefited members of the public, if there's any way that you could kind of assess that.
Well, I think one of the things is the point Chris has already made about the simplification and rationalisation of complaints procedures, as on the face of it should have made it easier for people to complain, and we've seen the numbers of complaints have gone up. So we could argue that there is certainly evidence that complaints standards role has benefited the public by making it easier to complain. I think that's the most obvious thing. Be harder to draw a line between a connection between that and any systemic improvements that may have taken place.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. The annual report talks about the percentage of complaints, and only 4% of complaints closed last year went through the entire investigation stage of the SPSO. Now, that's a much lesser amount than we've seen in previous years when you compare it to 7 or 8 years ago. So, is the SPSO fulfilling the functions if only a small number of complaints actually make it through to the full investigation stage?
Well, sorry, I'll start then, because I think the answer is it partly depends upon which of the functions you're looking at. If you're emphasising as the most important thing resolving as many complaints as possible and giving justice to as many individuals as possible, then it's not necessarily a problem that you don't go through the full process, because the reason for not going through the process may well be that there's a satisfactory early resolution, that the public body admits it got the mistake and it made a mistake and then provides the remedy. So in that sense, it's not a problem that you don't go through full investigations. But when you look at the other role of trying to identify systemic weaknesses and recommend systemic improvements, for that then you do need, I think, a fuller investigation. And from that perspective, this very small number of full investigations might be concerning. So it would be important, therefore, for the Ombudsman to get the correct balance. I don't think we, as researchers, have got the information that would let us make a judgment of whether the balance is correct, but it's certainly something that could be inquired into. And that is, for example, something that the Ombudsman might be encouraged to discuss with this committee. You know, why are there so few full investigations, and do you think that's actually undermining your task of finding systemic improvements as well as resolving individual grievances?
I would just add that there's a terminological issue here as well, I think, in terms of what a full investigation or investigation means, as opposed to what's happening in the earlier stages of the Ombudsman process. A lot of the cases that are closed prior to a full investigation will actually have been effectively investigated. So they will have been looked into, files will have been examined, people will have been spoken to, phone calls will have been made, but a decision simply will have been made that there's nothing further that can be done in that case, or perhaps that it's evident on the facts as they stand that a complaint shouldn't be upheld or pursued. So I think Ombudsman, this isn't just the SPSO, have got slightly tied in knots around this issue of what's an investigation and what isn't. Because actually I think most of the work that they're doing is inquisitorial. They are actually establishing facts. They are doing useful work for the benefit of the public and the public body. And actually depicting that work as not a full investigation and therefore not having value, I think is potentially problematic. And I think that's something that all ombudsmen should probably think a little bit about, because it does tend to undermine the story that they're able to tell about the value that they do actually deliver. Because I think a quick early resolution can be just as valuable as an investigation.
Absolutely. And you've also indicated that there's no real concerns with the quality of the complaint handling service or the process. But that comes about with data. And you've also indicated that there's a lack of data when you're trying to analyse some of that. So what data should be available to make a more informed assessment would be probably where we want to try and get to, because by doing that, you may then be able to assess how successful or how the process is actually working. But if there's a lack of data, then it's not really fulfilling the role.
Yeah. I think data is crucial. So I'd say that the data that we currently have in relation to quality is limited. So we've got, for example, customer satisfaction complaints, and we've got data about that. There's also an independent customer service reviewer, and we have the evidence of their findings and their reports that we can draw on. I think that's helpful. We also have the evidence that the SPSO produces in relation to requests for reviews of decisions. So we have that data. We also have data about judicial review challenges, of which I don't think that there have been any certainly reported cases. So we have some evidence from these kind of challenges, but I think that evidence is, as I say, quite limited. I think it should be supplemented, as I mentioned in my earlier answer, by customer satisfaction data and quality assurance data, and also by a regular programme of independent reviews, let's say on a 5-year basis. which would be able to kind of delve into issues that have been highlighted as concerns in this committee, for example, and could be informed by the types of questions you would like to see answered and the types of data that you would like to see surface.
Because by not having that full, complete picture, as you identified, then and it has been addressed in the past, but it hasn't been resolved as yet. So we still think there's more room for improvement.
Absolutely, I would say so.
Yeah. And I think that another point which possibly goes slightly beyond the committee's remit is that the different public sector ombudsmen around the UK, I think, could benefit from talking to each other about the way they collect and report data. And they're never all going to report it in the same way, but they could probably take steps to make it more comparable,
yes,
which would then put one in a better position to compare the performance of the different public sector ombudsmen.
Just on the point about data, I think the other thing that would be useful is that although as part of the Complaint Standards Authority there are data reporting requirements placed on public bodies, I think that whole data piece could be much better as well. I think in terms of what public bodies need to publish about the effectiveness of their complaints processes, they could put more in the public domain, different types of data. And I think, again, that would allow you to then reach a better assessment of how the Ombudsman is doing their complaint standards function.
Thank you. Thank you, Camille.
I'm now going to bring in Fulton McGregor.
Good morning to the panel. The committee is aware of some very the committee is aware of some very poor Trustpilot scores and reviews, and these have been highlighted by a recent petitioner to the Parliament. I'm wondering if you can give us any indication of how the committee can perhaps get a fuller picture of what the public perception is, because I do think it possibly is a wee bit in contrast to your own submissions.
Okay. So as I've indicated, I think it's very difficult in the absence of, let's say, customer surveys that are being done to contextualise individual stories of people who are disappointed and who will go on things like Trustpilot to kind of express those views. I suppose inevitably it's more likely that people who are disappointed are going to be wanting to express their view publicly and their disappointment. And so it may be that it's unrepresentative what we're seeing on Trustpilot. But it's very difficult to establish that in the absence of kind of better information. So I think it's strongly in the SPSO's own interest to commission that kind of customer satisfaction research in order to be able, on an objective basis, to contextualise these findings. If we just look at, the sort of number of complaints that are upheld and so on, there are obviously people who are having very satisfactory experiences, who are having their complaints upheld, who are going through the process without having an unsatisfactory service experience, without making a complaint about customer service. But yeah, I think, again, this goes back to data and the lack of it. So I think we really need to know more about that.
Okay, thanks for that. Your submission also discusses the Council of Europe's Venice Principles. How do you feel that the Ombudsman's performance and structures compare against those benchmarks?
Well, the Venice Principles are, of course, internationally widely accepted as a good measure of what ombudsmen ought to be doing. And I think we think that both the structure and the powers and the general approach of the SPSO are very much in line with the Venice Principles. They can be evaluated very favourably. There's a couple of cases in which our system doesn't directly correspond. For example, the principles say that the Ombudsman should preferably have power to challenge the constitutionality of laws and regulations that are promulgated under General Administrative Acts. And I don't think that would be appropriate in our particular constitutional system. But by and large, we are compliant, I think, with the Venice Principles. I don't think there's any concern that we are not consistent with those general international standards.
And what about the power to investigate cases using the Ombudsman's own initiative? What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that brings any benefits?
Yeah, I think the standard powers of investigation are adequate for both for the investigation of individual complaints and generally for finding out systemic weaknesses, because basically they do have the power to compel the production of all relevant information in the hands of the public body and to compel public servants to submit themselves to interview so that they are able to find out all the information that they need. I think the most obvious area in which the powers could be augmented would be to give the SPSO an own initiative power of investigation so that they would not have to wait for a complaint to come in. They might become aware in other ways of a possible systemic deficiency in a public service. They could then go and investigate that. So I think there is value in having an own investigation power.
Without wanting to put you in the spot, would you be able to give a practical example of what that might look like, where the power of initiative might be used?
Well, you might find, for example, that there are reports in the press relating to a particular public service, and it could be a health board and the way it deals with a particular health problem, or perhaps simply that in a particular health board a certain service is not meeting the public standards, but you don't have an individual complaint. So you could say, well, provisionally there's evidence that there's something perhaps generally going wrong here. We can investigate that and we can find out all the facts that are relevant to it. And that could be applied to any public service. I think there would obviously be an issue of resources, because you'd be adding a new power which is potentially very resource intensive. So two questions. One question would be, should the Ombudsman's budget be increased to reflect that power? And the second question would be for the Ombudsman themselves. They would have to decide how much of their resource to allocate to own initiative investigations as opposed to those that are triggered by complaints. And that would be quite an important strategic decision. And again, one that it would be worth the Ombudsman discussing their approach with the committee.
In terms of examples, if I may just add, there are some, so the Welsh Ombudsman and the Ombudsman in Northern Ireland now has these powers of own initiative investigation, so they're no longer sort of revolutionary in terms of sort of UK landscape of ombudsman. And so to give some examples of what they've investigated, the Welsh Ombudsman has carried out an initiative investigation into homelessness. So in that particular case, you know, there were no complaints from homeless people. There were widespread concerns about what was happening, but obviously it's very difficult for complaints to be raised directly by that particular group. So I think that's a really good example where the Ombudsman's aware of them not receiving complaints directly, because of the challenges that particular groups and particular individuals face, very widespread concerns being highlighted about an area, and then the Ombudsman being able to kind of step into that area. So that's why I see as the kind of main advantage of the own initiative, is basically being able to give justice and give a voice to people who are just unable to raise complaints themselves because of the very difficult situations they find themselves in. So I think homelessness is obviously an issue. I'm doing a project at the moment in Northern Ireland looking at asylum seekers and refugees and the extent to which they're able to raise complaints. And the reality is that they don't. So if you do want to increase access to justice for particular groups that are particularly vulnerable, particularly excluded, the own initiative power is one of the most important ways, I think, in which Ombudsmen can broaden the scope of justice that they provide beyond what is often a quite articulate middle-class user base in terms of who actually is able to use Ombudsman in the first place.
That's really interesting, Nigel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Fulton. And I'm now going to bring Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Professor Gallagher, Professor Mullen. I think Fulton McGregor has touched upon one of the questions I was going to ask in relation to vulnerable groups and broadening that access. So I'm just wondering, because you're saying there it's more likely to be people who are seen as middle class. How do we broaden that? How do we tackle that challenge to make sure that more vulnerable groups, and I'm thinking about female prisoners, I'm thinking about younger people as well, how do we actually get more people involved if they do have concerns to raise?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and as you say, Chris had already begun to answer that. There are a number of vulnerable groups, like the homeless, like asylum seekers, like female prisoners, who it's not reasonable to expect just to have the same capacity to make complaints as people in a much better position in their lives. And it's obviously going to take a long time to change their situations. You can't have an overnight solution to homelessness, for example. So you do need to take extra steps with them. And one measure, as Chris outlined, would be the own initiative investigation that could reach these groups, that could reach the concerns of these groups if the Ombudsman has evidence from other sources. More generally, of course, the Ombudsman could sort of look again at outreach, how they publicise their activities, how people get to find out about it, because it's probably the case that a lot of people in Scotland are unaware even of the existence of the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, and they're therefore not going to think of complaining. So obviously there is outreach, there is some publication, there's a website that anyone could look at, but it's not reaching people. So I think it's a twin-pronged approach of own initiative investigations and a closer look at the outreach strategy. And I wouldn't like to go into detail, but there are things that could be done to try and spread the message more widely that the Ombudsman exists and that it can help you with your complaints.
Thank you. And on that train of thought, the Parliament is looking at the role of commissioners over the next 6 months. It's a root and branch approach in terms of working out whether we have too many commissioners and the actual roles and the advocacy, the roles that they're meant to play in order for people to be able to access them for support. So what would you like to see the review of the commissioners achieve in relation to SPSO?
So I suppose one of the things that would be useful is just some kind of clarity or process for commissioning new commissioners and for those being kind of approved and legislated for. Because I think one of the issues potentially when there's an idea around a new commissioner being created is, where should it go? Should it be a new public body? Should potentially this be something that the Ombudsman could deal with? So I think from the Ombudsman's perspective, the idea that is perhaps open, particularly if it's a body that's going to have some kind of complaint function or oversight function, might be to give it to the Ombudsman. So I think some clarity over what happens when a new function is being debated and the kind of process that should be followed for that would be quite useful, just in terms of the Ombudsman not ending up with a jurisdiction that becomes too unfocused or too unwieldy. Although I think we've said, rightly, that at the moment the Ombudsman seems to be managing her various functions that have been given to her. I think there clearly is a danger of some of those functions ending up being problematic in future. So I think a bit of clarity over process and perhaps some principles over proliferation and relationship with Parliament would be helpful.
Yes, and just to add that, one has to be careful to understand that this word commissioner doesn't have a very specific meaning. It has been used to cover a range of offices and not all performing the same functions. So we need to be clear that one should concentrate on the function rather than the title. And I think the key thing when creating a new commissioner is saying, what is this person going to do? And then from that, work out the appropriate structure. So for a complaints handler, which has to be, it has to be independent, it has to be outside the Scottish Government departmental network, and it's got to have some degree of security of tenure so that they can make decisions fearlessly. And for that reason, an independent commissioner is a good model. But for other functions, you work out what the function is, and then you work out what the structure of the body is, and then you work out what powers it needs, because some other commissioners might not need the sort of compulsory investigation power that the Ombudsman has.
No, thank you very much, both. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Megan. Just a couple of things. Just one on the piece around the you suggested looking at the outreach strategy and how do we kind of develop and broaden that access. And I would just say language is an issue, right? Public service ombudsman. I mean, what does that mean to many people who've never actually started to go through the process? So yes, you might know it exists, or maybe you don't. That's one part. But then all the languaging, which is quite inaccessible as well for many people.
I think that is unhelpful. I think people tend not to know what an ombudsman is. I mean, I think things have improved a little bit recently in the sense that there are some ombudsmen that have become quite high profile, particularly the financial ombudsman service, things like PPI claims and so on. So I think the term ombudsman has a little bit of broader recognition than it perhaps might have had 15 years ago. But nonetheless, I think terminology is important. It is a barrier to people complaining, and that is something that can be looked at. I think one of the main ways we can kind of get around the kind of outreach issues is by ensuring that there's really kind of close work with people who are actually engaging with people who are experiencing difficulties, so kind of community and voluntary organisations, potential intermediaries that might be in a position to bring complaints. Again, that could be quite resource intensive to do, but I think if there's better relationships there, you could then see a kind of conduit or through pipe to the Ombudsman. I think it's probably ambitious to ever expect that ordinary people are going to know exactly what to do when a complaint arrives. So it's about trying to make sure that there are people that are close to those people who have that information to hand and ready. There have been some developments I think have been quite positive, thinking particularly of the work around the child-friendly complaints following the incorporation of the UNCRC. I think that approach to complaint handling, which is kind of rights-based, very much designed around kind of universal access, around trying to explain things in a straightforward way for children, actually has huge lessons for how we could kind of reconceptualize complaints processes for everybody, because actually most people need something at that level of kind of simplicity and accessibility. So I think more rights-based approaches and approaches that kind of follow on from, I think, the really excellent work that's been done in relation to child-friendly complaint handling could be one of the ways forward anyway in terms of opening the Ombudsman up a little bit.
And then just also kind of connected to that, I wonder if you've done any work along the lines of looking at the trauma that might come along with a process of complaint. I mean, I would say in Scotland generally don't have a culture of people feeling like we can complain about things. And so it's quite a big step to actually make a complaint. And in some situations, maybe there's some form of trauma. And Scotland, as I understand it, is a trauma-informed country. We're trying to move in that direction. We're even trying to do that more among members in the Parliament. And you've got this nice diagram of what the process is here. But parallel to that very linear, I'd say, process of this, then if this, then that, there is also the feeling experience that somebody's going through. And I just wonder if you've done any work on that or if anyone is looking into that kind of thing.
So there have been bits and pieces of research. I mean, one of the bits of research that I've conducted is looking at kind of trauma from the side of people who've been complained about, which is slightly to the side of your question. But that is a big area of research that's been particularly looked at in relation to kind of doctors and clinical professionals in terms of what is the impact on you of actually receiving a complaint. The kind of trauma of that, the kind of potential effect on future work practice and so on. So that is an area that has been researched, and I think trauma-informed approaches have been developed in relation to complaint resolution. There's a sort of stream of research which is called therapeutic jurisprudence, which has been applied to the Ombudsman context. So this is all about trying to make sure that it's not just about efficient processes and sort of outcomes and stats. It's actually about looking slightly more broadly actually how kind of trauma works and what the potential effect of one small complaint can be. There's been also work looking at the kind of psychosocial impact of complaints. So rather than, again, it just being a sort of narrow administrative issue, actually thinking, okay, well, what's the psychological impact on the individuals involved, but also what's the broader social impact of these complaints, which I think can be very, very significant. So there has been some work in that area. I've also done a little bit of work looking at complainants who've been very dissatisfied with their experiences. And one of the observations I made sort of speaking with those people is just how traumatic their complaint experience has been. You know, often going over sort of decades of sort of trauma, and often one of the things that's been particularly traumatizing is the way in which complaints processes have operated. Because actually they have re-traumatized people, or they've kind of stuck people in lengthy interminable processes, or they've kind of fed people's kind of despair, dissatisfaction, unhappiness. So often complaints processes can end up really exacerbating that. So I think trauma-informed approaches to complaint handling is an area that's developing, and I know the SPSO is interested in this area and has been doing work in it. But I think we're probably quite at the early stages in terms of how it's working.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. And it's good to hear that work is nascent, but exists to go along in that kind of parallel process that Scotland's undertaking around the whole trauma piece. And certainly I would be interested in hearing more from you as that develops. That concludes our questions for this morning, and I really, really appreciate both of you coming in and engaging with us in your work. I think it's been very helpful. And I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses.
Thank you.
And just before I introduce our second panel, I just wanted to make a note that Emma Roddick, MSP, is unable to join us this morning and sends her apologies. And we're joined on our second panel this morning by Paul Blaker, who's a member, and Peter Stewart Blacker, who's the chairman at Accountability Scotland, Fiona Colley, who is the head of Public Affairs and Communication at CARES Scotland, Jan Savage, who's the executive director at the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and Adam Statura, who's the Associate Director for Policy Communications and External Affairs at Age Scotland. And there's no need to turn your microphones on and off. We'll do that for you, and we'll direct questions to specific witnesses where appropriate, but you are welcome to come in and contribute, so please do that by indicating to the clerks or myself. And I will begin by my questions. So my first question is around the SPSO's achievement and the evidence that there is to support your views. So the intention of setting up the SPSO in 2002 was to establish a public sector complaint system which is open, accountable, easily accessible to all, and has the trust of the Scottish public. So I'd be interested to hear, and so this question is actually going to go across all of you. Has that been achieved from your perspective, and what evidence do you have to support that view? And maybe if I'll start with Jan, and then I'll just go Jan, Adam, Fiona, Peter, make it easy.
Thank you very much, Convener. Well, certainly, in respect of the interests of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, we are concerned with ensuring that Scotland's obligations, its international human rights obligations, to ensuring access to justice for everyone in Scotland related to the actions of the state is what's progressed through the mandate of the Public Services Ombudsman. There are critical principles of international human rights standards in respect of access to justice, that it should be accessible, that it should be timely, that it should be affordable, and that it should be effective. And certainly the mandate of the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman appears to deliver that. It's not for us to comment on the quality of how another office holder undertakes its duties, but certainly the evidence available to us through the publicly available data that Parliament has, as do all the witnesses in respect of the annual report, certainly suggests that the reach of the Ombudsman is extensive, that individuals are finding their way through that process, that it is free at the point of delivery. How satisfied individuals are with the outcomes of those processes are obviously matters for those individuals, but certainly in respect of supporting Scotland to meet its international human rights obligations around access to justice, the mandate and functions of the Public Services Ombudsman certainly appear to do that.
Okay, thanks. Adam, how about Age Scotland's perspective?
Well, it's definitely a necessary function, and I think from the feedback we'll have from our helpline, who will handle 30,000 calls a year, not all these are complaints, but mostly they are negative situations that people are in. But when it comes to complaints with public services, which in this sense, with related to SPSO, complaints with social care and how that is being dealt with by local authorities, for older people feeling that there is another route to go if their complaint has reached a conclusion at the original place, and that the person is not just marking their own homework, is really important in terms of that trust building. There's certainly something at the end of it, another route. And we haven't seen huge numbers of people giving us feedback of their experience of the Ombudsman, but last year we'll have been around about 20 people were sort of signposted or referred into the Ombudsman for further complaint because they hadn't, the situation had been and hadn't been resolved to their satisfaction. I think that's also very important, that people understand that, while there might have been a process that went through, they might not have reached the conclusion of the natural justice that they felt they needed, and the Ombudsman being a place that could have the final kind of point of delivery on that. Okay,
thank you. Fiona.
Thank you. I certainly agree with the points that Eddie made, but I would note that the trust is that the element of trust is something that is very difficult to measure. The SPSO is limited within its powers, but also it's limited in the resolutions that it can provide for individuals. They may not get the result that they expected, and looking at some of the figures, they may not have reached full investigation at all. it comes at the end of what has been a very adversarial process, and the complaints system, particularly around health and social care, where you're dealing with very challenging situations, can be unduly adversarial, and you saw that in the independent review of adult social care, and individuals were very much talking about how they didn't feel that they were able to access their rights, and the SPSO was part of that bigger picture, and it would indicate that individuals either do not access the SPSO, or they do not feel that when they do access the SPSO that they actually get the resolution that they need to enforce their own rights.
Okay, thanks very much. Peter.
Firstly, may I thank you, Convener, for allowing us to make this presentation to you. Accountability Scotland shouldn't exist. The SPSO should be able to deliver an adequate and effective administrative justice structure. Sadly, that we have experienced, and Trustpilot confirms this, that there is a major problem with that. Sorry, I had a stroke 2 years ago, and this is really quite difficult.
No, take your time. If you'd like to bring Paul in at any point to support you.
I think I might let
Please
Paul carry on at this
Can
point.
Understand that this experience can be quite intense. Yeah.
So as someone who's experienced the service firsthand, I've made 3 complaints. I was at the time I was outraged at the level, the quality of service. I mean, I've got extensive experience of dealing with complex complaints from big organisations, and they simply, I mean, there was evidence given us this morning from both professors talking about bias. Now, for me, you know, one example would be that I made a complaint about school catchment. I was told my daughter didn't meet the criteria for a certain school. I then FOI'd a copy of the rules which were hidden. I got the rules which proved I was being misled. I presented that evidence to the Ombudsman, i.e. here's the specification, these are the rules, this is what they've told me, and the Ombudsman found in the other party's favour. It's just incredulous, you know. But there's also another concern, which I'll talk about later on, which is 100 times worse. And it comes back to, very simply, they're not adequately and effectively investigating the matters. And I think the big issue for me is also about the 50% which meet the statutory test are not investigated. And there's definitely an area of concern around that. Lots of people complain about they're not properly investigated. And I think that's the biggest issue that I think the public have and our members have.
Thanks very much. I've got another question which is kind of connected to this, is around neutrality. So some of our submissions that we received raised the issue around the SPSO's neutrality when looking into complaints against public bodies. And I'd be interested to hear what the experiences of the people that you represent in their dealings with the SPSO, and is this perception justified? So I won't go across because maybe you don't have an answer for that for everyone, but I'm certainly, if you want to indicate in wanting to respond to that question. Fiona.
I suppose it's a difficult question to answer because this is very much about individual experience, but I think this is potentially led by the experience of the knowledge of the powers of the SPSO and what it can and can't do. And not upholding where it does not have the powers to be able to enforce a decision. And I think also when we look at the level of complaints and that reach full investigation, that may also be impact on an individual's experience of the SPSO and their belief that it is too close to other public bodies that is investigating.
Okay, thanks for that. Anybody else?
Well, I think
Paul?
in my case, so I made some very serious allegations about a local authority. And under the SPSO's own rules, when there is two contesting stories, they are mandated to test those two competing stories. So the allegations I made were well-founded, and they decided to take at face value what they had received from the third party. Now, subsequent to that, I went to court to obtain the evidence to prove that the other party had provided inaccurate information to the Ombudsman. In fact, had deliberately falsified school records, caused significant harm to my daughter. Over 10 records were falsified. A risk assessment was falsified. In fact, the whole thing was falsified to cover up multiple failings after the event. I made this allegation to the Ombudsman at the time, and I went through the whole process of draft, final and review, and nothing wrong. Now, I will say, in their defence, that post going to court and getting the evidence after 18 months, I'm told it's the first time it's happened, the Ombudsman have decided to reopen the investigation. But the challenge is that the other party is refusing to play ball. So the Ombudsman has written to them and said, we are now satisfied that you gave us inaccurate information, which we based our decision on. You now need to start the process again and give us a new stage decision, which they're not doing. So it's a really interesting point to see what the Ombudsman is going to do next, because this is a national issue, because it's not just my daughter who's been affected by this. This has been going on for years, apparently. They underreport the bullying and weapon incidents to keep the records down, and when something goes from bad to worse because they haven't done what they're meant to do, they can go back in, create new records, backdate them, or alter previous ones in a way that looks like it was done at the time. Now, if we had the police doing this, or we had doctors or nurses doing this, there'd be an outcry. But not a problem when it happens to our children, which is... So what I'm trying to say is that I made these allegations. I gave them the evidence. I gave them enough. But they basically ignored me and just found completely another party's in favour at the time.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Peter.
Can I just add to this whole situation? The biggest problem that I personally had is that I had made a complaint about Scottish Enterprise, and they didn't use best practice to measure my complaint against, which would be considerably easier if at stage 2 the authorities under jurisdiction actually if at stage 2, if the bodies under jurisdiction had to deliver how this should have happened, all I can say is the best example of an ombudsman I ever came across was Gibraltar. And the way they operate, which I think should be mirrored in Scotland as well, is the Gibraltar's ombudsman. It was a walk-in service, and they interviewed the complainant. And once they got the idea, they then went to the authority and asked them how should it have been done. And then they wrote to the authority and said, this is how we think it was done. Can you explain the difference between the two? That is something that Rosemary does not do, and the SBS has never done. So instead of a very straightforward investigation, it becomes tortured and long-winded and expensive. So it's there is no surprise when the Ombudsman is slow to deliver justice and doesn't achieve. Because when you use best practice, it's very easy. The example I understood was with Gibraltar. There were tenants who were in a block of flats. They were complaining about the windows. and they asked them how should the windows have been. So it was immediately obvious from the specification of the windows and then the result which was lacking in the specification, much as my case had actually involved a pilot scheme by Scottish Enterprise, and they didn't use best practice. In fact, they used no guidance at all. So the Ombudsman spent 3 hours, and frankly, he didn't understand what was going on. Because if he had a document that said, this is what should go on, and this is how it should be dealt with, it becomes so much easier for the complainants. The interesting thing is with Gibraltar, that he found for about 25% of the complainants and yet achieved 97% satisfaction because he took the time to explain precisely how he saw the solution to it. Again, the Ombudsman does not do that.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a number of questions to go through, but I think that was helpful to get an indication of an example of another place that you feel is a good model we could look at. I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey, who's joining us online with a couple of questions.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I think those issues that both Paul and Peter raise there are issues about who deals with complaints about the Ombudsman Service. And I imagine that will inevitably find its way into our discussion as we take this inquiry a bit further. But for the moment, I wonder if I could look at the Ombudsman's report itself for the panel and ask them to comment on the significant increase in complaints that the Ombudsman received compared to the previous year. I think it's up 33%, in fact. Do any of the witnesses able to comment on what they feel are the reasons for those increases? What kind of trends are we seeing? What kind of areas of public service are we noticing more complaints coming in? And I'd be very much obliged if you would share your thoughts on any of those issues, please. Maybe start with Adam.
It's a really interesting question. I think we're finding that challenges to how public services are delivered just now is having a considerable knock-on effect to people's experiences of this. This is not an overnight phenomenon, but probably something we've been witnessing for the last decade or so. If we're looking particularly in issues around social care, for instance, we'll find times in the year where people are being denied access to care, for instance, by local authority. We've seen huge cutbacks almost before the start of a financial year, where people's packages have been, social care packages, downgraded from having substantive need to now being like Lazarus, decided they no longer need care packages. And that will obviously warrant a complaint if you went through the local authority system. Well, then they'll say, well, this is the decision we've come to, and the next place to go would be an ombudsman. There'll undoubtedly be, over time, better awareness of ombudsmen in general. Sorry, I can't remember what the collective noun is for them. But I'm thinking about that as the last place. There'll be lots of, judging itself from the Ombudsman's website, places and spaces where you can be referred to or have support to access that. I mean, Scotland's Helpline is one of them, so knowing that a service exists and there becomes a new place. But I think it's definitely, the origin of this is probably to do with challenges on the delivery of public services and growing need, quite frankly, and the growing need that we've seen since last few years, the start of an extensive cost of living crisis. And pressure on the finances to deliver what people need. And undoubtedly that's going to show in people's satisfaction levels with our services.
Thank you, Adam.
Willie, Paul indicated he wanted to come in, so I'm just going to bring him in.
So, a couple of points on the data. I think, obviously, there's more complaints being made, right, in the first instance, to the authorities. Now, we talk about being aware of the Ombudsman or not, it's very clear when you get a stage 2 decision that it signposts you to the Ombudsman. Okay? So to me, there's obviously a connection between public services getting worse, people not happy with the service, and then they see it signposted to the Ombudsman. But one piece of data which really concerns me is the number of premature complaints to the Ombudsman, which has more than doubled to something like 918 from something like 462 or something like that the year before. Okay, so it's very simple, right? To go to the Ombudsman, you have to have a stage 2 decision. 900 people, over 900 people this year hadn't worked that out. Okay, now that indicates to me potentially either how the Ombudsman does it, but I think it's more likely to be how is the level of the people who are trying to get justice. We talked about middle class people like myself, if I put myself in that bracket, right, who understand it, we know what to do. But if 900 people have went to them with a stage 2 decision and it's doubled, then there's something wrong. So that needs to be addressed.
Right. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I didn't see who put their hand up first, but Fiona and then Jan.
I suppose I wanted to reflect on Adam's comments and the sort of wider comments around availability of services, and obviously our focus is primarily around health and social care. And I mentioned the review of adult social care earlier, and many disabled and older people and carers feeling that they were simply abandoned during the pandemic, and that feeling of abandonment and that feeling of reducing services but needs not changing, reducing services but needs increasing, is one that I think has a fundamental impact upon complaints in the whole system. And I think what we need to remember around the past few years is the people who've been providing support, in our case referring to unpaid carers. There's an increasing number of people who are providing significant levels of care. That is primarily around unmet need around social care services, and people being told that their services are limited or quite simply not available. And quite frankly, carers are exhausted, and that does lead to more complaints around the services or lack of services received.
Thank you. Jan.
Thank you. Yeah, I just would echo everything that colleagues on the panel have said about exploring some of the reasons why there may have been such an increase. I think they're all absolutely valid, and I also have to sort of pay tribute to all the individuals that are behind every single one of those complaints, because I think, as colleagues have acknowledged, they're exhausted, and the Commission is well aware of just how difficult the access to justice system in Scotland is, and how the finding yourself to the final stage of an SPSO complaint is the end of a very, very long, often adversarial, exhausting process on top of the issues that you're complaining about. I just wanted to expand a wee bit on what what happens as a result of observing these trends, and I just wanted to highlight that points to a weakness in the current mandate of the public the SPSO, insofar as these themes that are emerging here are telling us something about how access to justice is being experienced, about how public services are being experienced, but the Public Services Ombudsman does not have any opportunity to take a thematic look at that or to raise any own name investigations around those emerging themes. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that exists around access to justice in Scotland just now, is the ability for systems to really learn from what is happening, and ensure that the appropriate bodies have the appropriate resources and powers to be able to do something about it. So it's one of the reasons that we really welcome the approach that this committee is taking today, because it allows us to air these issues, and currently committees of Parliament can do what the office holders cannot, and that is perhaps take that thematic approach and take a deeper dive into it, because any one of the issues that we've just explored here in the last 5 minutes on the panel would certainly merit that.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Back to you, Willie.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody, for that question. I wonder if I could go back to Fiona. Maybe you were talking, Fiona, about unpaid carers just a wee moment ago in your answer to my first question, and I think in your submission you were telling us that unpaid carers don't really have any meaningful access or to resolution or redress through the Ombudsman. I wonder if I've understood that correctly, and maybe for the benefit of the committee and the public, what's the position with unpaid carers if they feel that they need to raise an issue and take it to an Ombudsman? Do they have that access? And if not, how should
I guess there's probably two sides to that. There's first around the accessibility of the service itself, and that includes the complaint service. It's not just about the Ombudsman and about individuals having the right information at the right time with the right support, and support to be able to make complaints is fundamental, and support with the outcome of complaints. I noted that the committee were discussing around trauma-informed practice, and making a complaint is fundamentally traumatic for individuals. But the wider question of redress, we can find that individuals go through the whole process, and even when a complaint's upheld, it doesn't really change their situation to any great extent. So, say, for example, where a decision around support or a service and the complaint was upheld, we have heard from individuals where their assessment has simply been reviewed, and the process has been followed, and therefore there's not a ability to be able to complain again. So that's one. The second point is actually when there is no resolution, when a complaint isn't upheld or not fully investigated, doesn't get to the full investigation process, where do carers go? Where do individuals go? And the only place they can go is to the legal system. And for many carers who live in poverty, there's a cost implication to that. Some will qualify for legal aid. If you have significant resources, you can probably go down that route, or may be able to go down that route. But if you're somewhere in the middle, you're not going to get any resources to be able to fight your case through the legal system. And we have found that when a resolution is discussed, then things like legal aid are removed. So there's not an ability to take it any further, even if you're not particularly happy with the outcome, and you actually think there's a point where this is not just about you, this is about the wider system and the experience that many carers and disabled people and older people face. So you don't have there's not a great deal of case law in relation to social care in Scotland. There's more in England. And those barriers are one of the reasons why there isn't a full system of redress for carers and for the people they care for.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for a few of the extra information in that. Isn't that the same for everybody, though? If they were unhappy with an outcome, then they could press the button and go down the legal route and so on and so forth. So what distinguishes the experience that perhaps carers might have as opposed to anyone else that raises a complaint and was unhappy with the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an entirely reasonable comment. But what I would say is carers are providing support for individuals worth £15.9 billion in Scotland. And without them, health and social care would quite simply collapse. And if they do not have access to the support and the justice that they need to be able to provide the support to the individual that they love, then that is a very different situation to many other types of complaints. And I think we do need to differentiate in some way in understanding that in terms of that access to redress, to be able to enforce not only their rights. And when we talk to unpaid carers, the reality is they're not really particularly bothered about themselves. It's about the individual that they care for, and that person has not had their rights met. And at the moment, there is not sufficient justice to enable people to have their rights under human rights legislation, the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. So I think it's just about making sure that we understand that difference, and that we're not actually enabling individuals to have justice, to have the best lives they can possibly have. And and the system at the moment is a barrier to it.
Okay, thanks for that, Fiona. That's something I'm sure that the committee will be keen to take on board as we do some more work on this. But thank you for that answer. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Willie. And just before I bring in Fulton McGregor, I'm going to come to Peter.
Can I just bring up one point? The lack of appeal to the decisions that the Ombudsman makes. The only legal way is to take a judicial review against the Ombudsman. That is financially impossible to achieve, even for bodies under jurisdiction. Under the current stringent times, they can't even afford to take judicial review. So the complainants can't either. What the access to an appeal to the Sheriff Court, in a similar way to that of the Children's Panel, where a simple procedure could be used to take a point to appeal on a point of the way that the Ombudsman has met, makes it because simple procedure I think costs £123. So it is well within the ability of people, and they don't have to take the risk, because the most they can lose is
10% of what you're asking for, up to £3,000 normally.
And Paul has won his case against the Ombudsman, and it is a simple, quick solution to actually getting people to look at it. The other problem we have is that the Ombudsman is a toothless tiger. She has been unable to get a local authority to answer her questions. So we do need a change in the Act to allow a degree of compulsion for them to answer the questions she's asking. And that way we would get much closer to justice as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Fulton.
To all of you, thanks very much for the evidence so far. I just want to explore something that the Ombudsman told this committee before I was a member right enough last year. And that was that, and I quote this, "We see good complaints handling in the first instance by public bodies." Do you as a panel agree with this? Do you agree that that's one of the reasons that, you know, the complaints haven't fully progressed right through every stage? I mean, what I would say, you know, before you come in, is that it's not what I tend to see as an MSP. However, going back to what the last panel had said, that could be, I'm quite willing to reflect that could be because I'm only getting people who are very unhappy, you know, and they're coming to me for that bit of advice and support. But I certainly, my own evidence in MSP doesn't back that up. I wondered if I could come to some of the panel, what you might think in that. And I wonder for this question if I could go to Jan, Adam and Fiona, because my second question probably focuses on Peter and Paul, and you'd have a chance to come in at that point. Jan?
Thank you. I think it points to this a dual mandate of office holders. So the one part is ultimately the, the complaints process and ensuring that there's an ombudsman in place that progresses with complaints through to the end degree. But also part of that mandate is to promote better practice and to have a preventative approach and ensure that actually public services are being supported to deliver human rights best practice and fundamentally support people to live good lives. So I'm quite sure that if the Ombudsman has said that to the committee, that she will have had the evidence that there are good quality complaints handling processes happening at that first stage resolution. Is that enough? Of course not. And you'll be seeing that through the numbers of increased complaints coming through to the Ombudsman, but also as you've reflected what you see in your own caseload and often what comes through to the Scottish Human Rights Commission. But of course the Scottish Human Rights Commission is not permitted to offer advice to individuals under any circumstances. So we can see that there are absolutely challenges at all stages of the complaints process. So I think it's probably fair to reflect that that is a function and a purpose of the Public Services Ombudsman, is to deliver support for public services to do better. But it's, and I'm sure she will have the evidence to suggest that that is progressing, but there's clearly more work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's certainly something about public services will have documented, well-versed, probably quite robust complaints procedures, things that are written out. And once it gets to the Ombudsman, undoubtedly they'll be looking at, have those processes, are they robust? Have they been followed? And the answer is probably yes. Now that's different to what the material that's being assessed is and the quality of that. And I think there's two parts to this. There are some points earlier on about particular examples, but if people are maybe finding it challenging getting the right information from, let's say, a local authority, to show what they have done or done wrong. They've maybe, while going through their experience, not been spending their time cataloguing, recording every single instance, the when, the how, the what, having documentation. These will be things that people have experienced, not necessarily logged. So having that information, having the evidence might be something lacking, but the actual process itself might have been fine, but the material within that lacking therein. So potentially the Ombudsman has got to that point, and if there's no change in the information that they've actually received, but the process, that line, all the steps have been followed, then you can imagine it quite difficult to say, well, something fundamentally wrong here. So I think that may be why you're sort of seeing that kind of gap. But I think this definitely boils down to how people feel empowered enough to get the information that they need, that they've had support to kind of gather this and share it. And quite frankly, in the heat of the moment, understand what has happened. Because there will be times that people are dealing with moments of crisis, they're not thinking about what's the other thing I need to kind of capture or gather. I've just got to go and deal with this problem just now, and I'll get to that later. I'm sure we've all been in situations like that, where I wish I'd just got that thing, or I wish I remember what happened here or there. And we've also got to remember that there'll be 500,000 over 50s in Scotland who don't use the internet, that won't necessarily be there kind of cataloguing documents or uploading things wherever they are, and there'll be bits of paper here, or they've heard something from somewhere else. And so actually thinking about people's ability to do that as well, and if they're supported throughout the whole process to have a good experience, then they shouldn't be getting to a complaints process in the first place. That's obviously not happening. To your point, Mr Gregor, that you'll be having exactly the same experiences that charities like Age Scotland are. People are coming to you with the worst problems. And
I wanted to ask you about that before bringing Fiona in as well. Do you think this is impacted by almost like a scale of seriousness, if that's the right word? So what I mean by that is that, is the Ombudsman able to say with confidence that the investigations by public bodies are being done well in the main? Is there a seriousness scale there? Because what I would say as an MSP, and I'm sure it's the same for the charities that are represented, the ones that do seem to come to me eventually seem to be really quite serious and complex, and that's me. Have you found that? Is that an issue there? Is it the less serious ones are perhaps getting dealt with pretty well and quickly by public bodies, and then the more that you go up that scale, the
in a sense, it's sort of easier to do potentially. Yeah. I think what's also
I'm just wondering in terms of the evidence here, if it's something.
We don't have any.
And Fiona's charities.
Yeah, we don't have any particular evidence on that, because a lot of this will be subjective as well. Because that experience I'll have might be very different to Fiona's or yourself. Okay. But there'll definitely be about a resourcing issue as well, I'd imagine, with any ombudsman or any public service. And we go around the houses in this place around how we're spending public money on whether it's commissioners, whether it's something else, and do we have the resources that we need to deal with them. And if you look at this particular ombudsman and the length of time it will take, for instance, to have a case allocated. In the first instance, which I think is around about, for my notes, was about 4 months to have it allocated in the first place, and then there could be an answer in about a year. Now, do forgive me if those figures have changed since then, but you can see that not just the volume increases of complaints, but the time it's taken to get anywhere near it being allocated, and what do you do if you've just got an absolute full wave of complaints coming in? What do you focus on? It's a very simple kind of arithmetic there of what can we actually deal with in the time. So there might be some challenges there in terms of what the Ombudsman has at their disposal to deal with effectively 2024 public services in Scotland.
Okay. Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would reflect what the other panel members said, and I think it's very difficult to say whether that there is evidence there that that is the case, or there's evidence there that it's not the case that it's robust. I think our experience, very similar to yourself, is that we will hear from carers who are having the most difficult experiences and are not getting resolution and are having to go through complaints procedures that they find challenging, adversarial. And I think we need to remember in any of these situations that the different power dynamic, and that individuals who are making complaints are not the people with the power, and that can, one, deter people from making a complaint in the first place, because they don't feel that they will be heard, or it can make them decide not to go any further, and actually it's an exhausting experience. It can take far longer than the guidelines for how long a stage 1 and a stage 2 should take to be concluded, and for many individuals they simply don't have access to the information, don't have access to knowledge about the SPSO, and don't have access to support to be able to even start a stage 1 complaint. So I think that's I think it's a question. There's probably a bit of a mix in terms of the robustness of complaints procedures.
Thanks very much. And for my next question, for Peter Stewart and Paul, if that's okay. So you're kind of coming at from the question that I asked there, you're almost coming from the reverse of that, where you're referring to the high rate of complaints that have been upheld, which have gone through the SPSO investigation stage, and suggesting that that indicates and shows that many public bodies are still getting it wrong. What's your thoughts on that? Is that something you would be okay to elaborate on a wee bit? And I'm okay if you want to go in.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was myself who wrote that. So, you know, if you think about it, if you're effective, you would expect that over time the number of complaints being made to the Ombudsman would drop, and the number of complaints upheld by the Ombudsman would drop if the public sector bodies would following the correct model, complaint models, and doing their job. Okay, but the opposite's happening, right? Year on year, we're seeing an increase in number of complaints, and we're seeing every year the number of complaints upheld up to 70%, which to me indicates, a problem. Now, so how did the public sector, the authority, not work that out themselves? Is the question 72% of the time? That's the question we ask. And I think it comes back down to, there's one thing that the public sector authorities, and I've got extensive experience, either I'm really unlucky, but I've taken NHS board to court for a member of the family who died. We even had the death certificate said that they caused the death. There was even a homicide investigation, and it went all the way to the Court of Session, to the steps before they would pay out, okay? Because they decided that's their process. They try to bury you, run out of money. They're brilliant at covering up. They're brilliant at playing the games. They know how the system works. The system is written in a way to protect them. So if you take my example here with the Ombudsman, even though they're going back in to investigate, right, and say, you've given us the wrong information, we've now got evidence you've given the wrong information, right? What they're not going to do is they say, investigate why two individuals, deliberately falsified 10 school records, a risk assessment, put a child at harm. They foresaw their harm to the child, didn't implement the risk assessment as part of because that wasn't required to reduce the harm. They've foreseen that harm then happened. They then covered up more records, right? Now, all that stuff's going on. I cannot get anyone in Scotland to investigate this element, which comes back to my human rights. So my daughter has suffered significant harm due to the state and what they're doing. And even though the Ombudsman is now saying that she will go back in and investigate, she's not going to investigate the conduct of the individuals who falsified the records, because she can't under legislation. She's prevented from doing that. Okay? Now, who's really meant to be doing it is either the police or the General Teaching Council of Scotland, but neither of them will do it. because they know it's part of a bigger problem and they don't want this problem to be exposed across the public. Because if the public found out that this was going on all the time, and I've got the data to prove they're underreporting the bullying, right, and the weapon incidents, IFOI'd all 32 councils, got the data, pulled it all together, put it into the government and said, we've got a problem. They're all significantly underreporting bullying in Scotland. The average number of bullying incidents per school per year recorded was 3, which is just ridiculous. Clackmannanshire Council, bless their little cotton socks, they managed to record 1 bullying incident in all its schools across a year. Right? Ridiculous. Right? So they need to report the bullying, and that's why thousands of children are getting harmed, but they don't, right? Because it's all about public image and we don't want the system to be seen. And then what happens is, if it goes from bad to worse, what's happened in our case, they can go back in and create new records and backdate them, or they can go and alter previous ones. Simply appalling. It's fraud. It's impacting thousands of children. I've got no doubt it's going on across the board. And the authority, they know this. Everyone knows this. But no one will do anything about it. And what happens is the government signposts me back to the SPSO, because under legislation we can't get involved into the case. Education Scotland have said exactly the same thing. Right? HSC have said the same thing. General Teaching Council say the same thing. Right? So what we really need is, if that's the case, we need an ombudsman who's got teeth, who can hold bodies to account and has powers to do something. Because we can't have a situation where children, thousands, we know this, the data's out there, they've been harmed, and they've been harmed because it's not been dealt with properly. The process the government got in place is actually very good. It says, if someone alleges bullying, you record it, what's involved, and you say, this is what we've done, and this is the outcome. They don't do it, because it means accountability. So they whitewash it, they hide it, they cover it up. And then they've got the wee secret weapon which they can go back in and falsify it all. It's outrageous, right? I'm sorry to go on about this, right? But no one is doing anything about it, okay? Everyone runs a mile, including my MSPs. There's only one MSP. Yeah. Okay, but I'm just saying, I make my point. There's only one MSP who's helped me.
Can I just come in here? I think a lot of the problem with the SPSO is the Act is inadequate, because there are bodies like the Children's Panel that are not covered by the Act. So we've got people who are being bullied by the Chief Executive of the Children's Panel. And this woman has given years of work to the Children's Panel, has not been paid for it. And she has been constantly bullied by this particular chief executive, who I understand has just been confirmed again for 5 years. But there is no recourse for this particular woman to complain. But the Ombudsman says, well, it's not within my jurisdiction. There are a huge number of organisations that are not supervised by the Ombudsman.
Yeah, so that's the point you're making there, is what is the Ombudsman's remit in certain situations. Well, thanks very much, and Paul and Peter both gave your evidence very passionately, as did the other panel members, so thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Fulton. I'm now going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. We've already touched on timescales and the length of the process, and I think, Adam, you spoke about that earlier when we talked about 4 months and a year. But in your submission, Age Scotland also commented on the length of time that the SPSO considers and the backlog. Now, there is a backlog we're already aware of, and that backlog, I'm sure, is getting bigger depending on how many are coming through the system. And that's very frustrating for any individual if they feel that their case is going to take a considerable length of time to progress, and even when it does progress, that they don't get necessarily the result they expect. So what impact does that have on the public trust of this whole complaints system? That's my question to you all, because I cannot see there not being an impact on this process, and if there is an impact, it may well be a negative impact rather than a positive one. So it would be good to get your views on that. Maybe, Adam, you can start, because you were the Aid Scotland put that specifically in their submission.
No, that's a good question. Look, so we don't have, because of the people coming back to us after they've gone through the SPSO process isn't too voluminous, I can't give you any kind of finite detail on that, but there are obvious things here, aren't there? Yeah. That if you're not just got a huge length of time when you're at that final stage and gone through however many complaints procedures to get some kind of access to justice or resolution to your issue, and find that actually you are the back of the queue, which is going to be getting bigger. It goes back to my earlier point about the resourcing required to handle it. But the SPSO isn't unique in this. I'll come back to the original trust bit in a second. We've seen this with places like the Office of Public Guardian, if people are trying to get power of attorney documents, which are absolutely vital in some circumstances, but there'll be huge waits for that and that backlog, and there's been issues around the kind of infrastructure to do so and whatnot. So we've got to be really smart in Scotland about what we expect of these services, and have they got the resources that are required to deal with this, to avoid the backlog, but also then to handle that when it comes in. But if you've gone through probably quite a traumatic, to some degree, or varying degree, complaints procedure, let's say the local authority or the health board or something else, and you've come to the conclusion that the SPSO is the next place, and you're at the back of a queue and it's a bit of a never-ending moment, you could, quite frankly, just give up and not feel there's anyone there for you. And that will have a big impact on trust. It will also impact their people's sentiment about public services in general then, about feeling that there's no one out there for me and I just cannot get the access. I know what's gone wrong, but nobody believes me, nobody can help me fix this. I think there's a very good point there about if you've got these big backlogs, not just irregular processing, they're only going to get worse unless there's more resource to tackle that.
And Jan, you, with your whole aspect within your own role, that right seems to now be being diminished in some ways for individuals as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, so the time frame and the resourcing are obviously matters for the Ombudsman ourselves to discuss. I don't need to imagine, we've done some research into this and the impact that not having a timely resolution to a complaint has on trust and confidence in the system, trust and confidence in the state. But more than that, the opportunity then for a timely remedy. And that's probably the bigger issue here is the teeth part of what's been discussed today. Is what happens next. So being heard and finding that there is a truth to your complaint is the first part of access to justice for individuals. Something changing and happening as a result is the second. And that feedback loop and the opportunity to consider that as part of the complaints process is still missing. So I think the timeline is an important part of it, but actually that question probably could be extended to look at the so what happens as a result, and that possibly is more accurately reflecting of where lack of trust in the system comes.
And Fiona, you go.
Yeah, definitely. Just to echo the same, and I think that point about a timely remedy is so critical because, for example, if someone is complaining that their social work services have been withdrawn or reduced, they're going to be living with the impact of that whilst they wait for that not timely remedy. And that can be very significant on their health and well-being and very significant on the health and well-being of their carer. I think the point around 4% of complaints going to full investigation, I think that's I find that challenging. I think if you said to the public, complain to the SPSO, but only 4% of your complaints will be go to full investigation, I think the response might be, why bother? And I think that is indicative of something that really could impact on public trust. And I think something around what the Ombudsman measures in terms of people's experience of their part of the complaint system, and do we actually measure what individuals' responses are to finding that their their complaint isn't going to full investigation? And I think there's something about how do we measure that experience at different points, and with different outcomes, not just about where things are upheld, but even when things are upheld, what does that mean? And did that actually provide a resolution? So there's something about how do we really measure across the system, are our public services operating effectively, and is there access to justice good and timely?
And I think, Peter and Paul, you've already made quite clear your views on some of this, and I'm not disagreeing, because I think the compelling evidence we've heard today very much backs up what you've been saying earlier about the whole process and how it seems to be stacked against you, even if you're in the right process and going forward. But at the same time, if you're not, and you're at the back of the queue and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're still waiting, then there's a bigger problem to manage.
I've had to seek psychological supports, right, through this. When you know you're right and you know you're being abused by the state, which I have been, right? Not just abused, I've been threatened, I've been bullied. When I threatened to take legal action to get the evidence, which was the history metadata of when these records were actually recorded, they knew that I was right, and they basically threatened me, right, with consequences, the authority, right, if I took such action. I actually became ill as a result of that. And I had to get medical support. And I've been seeing a psychologist as a result in effect, to protect me from them trying to poison me and trying to run me down, which is, it's kind of gold standard where they kind of deal with you at first, and eventually when you get close to them, they start attacking you, they start trying to undermine you. I mean, I was banned from every building in my local authority's area for the audacity for pursuing the truth. And the staff were told, should I turn up in any building and not leave the building, the police would be called because I was a danger, right? Because I was asserting myself, right? When we got to courts, they get absolutely hammered by the courts because they tried their tricks with the court and they had none of it. And they were blasted, humiliated and heavily criticised and told they had to investigate matters again, and they didn't because the court couldn't force them, because the claim I had, the action I had, was to get the information I needed at the time. It's appalling and it's massive. And I know lots of people who I've met through this process with Peter, horrendous experience in people's lives. Horrendous.
We questioned the previous panel, Professor Gill and Professor Mullen, about some of the aspects of responsive and being, and they talked about the data, and there was a lack of data, or there's a mismatch of what with the data being supplied, and there needs to be more investigation into some aspects of that data. They saw that there was a gap amongst some of that. I'm getting the sense from yourselves that you also believe that to be the case. And for us as a committee, when we're trying to understand how to respond to customer concerns when it comes to the SPSO, if we don't get the data, and you're not getting the data as individuals or organisations, it's very difficult then to make an assessment on that, because it's through data that we can get the process and can understand. But if that data is limited, if that data is being manipulated in some ways, and that may be the case, you've given evidence already this morning, Paul, where you've seen that. Age Scotland already understand that sometimes that people get run out of the process because the length of time it takes, and it's being run down, or they're being run down because of their age, that it's going to, they may expire by the time it progresses, and that may happen in some people's processes. So the data that we collect and the data that is provided is vitally important to trying to analyse where we take the whole process here, and how we can, as a committee, then manage to see how effective the SPO is. Peter, you want to come in?
Can I just say that the two professors referred to the Venice principles. One of that says that there should be an independent, in-depth investigation into the Ombudsman's quality of its work. And the other thing that the Venice principle says, that it should not interfere with the judicial independence of the Ombudsman. May I just use an analogy? The Ombudsman is like Heinz Beans factory without quality control at the end of it. If you don't have quality control, you have no idea how bad or good the resultant beans are. It's something that is essential because we don't see any quality control within the Ombudsman at all.
Can I add to that? So they did publish customer satisfaction figures from the public. So I stuck an FOI in and said, give me the information you hold on this. So it turns out that the only, at the time, we're sending a survey to people who had investigations, actual investigations, right? Which is obviously skewing it, because if they're actually saying that at the moment 72% of the individuals get a successful outcome, then you're going to get a more favourable response. However, when I pointed out to them that I had had 2 investigations, complete investigations, and I hadn't received the survey, they couldn't explain that. Right? So read what you want into that.
Can I just add very briefly? The Ombudsman years ago used to employ consultants called Praegforth, who used to do a customer service satisfaction survey thoroughly, but they stopped it. It ended up not being favourable to the SPSO, which is again why we need an independent investigation into are they doing their job properly or not.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Jen?
Yes, please, if that's okay. Thank you. I think really important questions to be asking about what data does Parliament need in order to hold the Ombudsman to account, because ultimately that's the accountability structure that exists around all of the independent office holders. Now, I'm not completely conversant with what the legislation prescribes in terms of what the Ombudsman must put into their annual report. I would imagine it's not too prescriptive, and that will be a matter for the Ombudsman to decide. So I think through these conversations and what you find as a committee, being a bit more prescriptive about what data is required would be a really helpful thing. There would obviously be resource implications and all the rest of it to work through, but I think that coming from a committee through the Ombudsman and then through to SPCB would be a really, really important step forward. And again, I commend the committee for having this session today and for inviting in external witnesses, because I think that's the only way you really do progress accountability in the way that it's intended. But that would be my overarching comment, that would be a role for Parliament to work with the Ombudsman on.
Okay. Fiona?
I suppose just very briefly, in agreeing again with all that's been said around that measurement of people's experience, and it doesn't appear effective just now, and it does need to be much stronger. It also needs to work through how it measures the people that are not accessing the support and why, the support of the SPSO and why, and looking at what work they can do as an ombudsman in terms of reducing those barriers and what they're doing and the outcome of that, because there are certainly many people that it's a barrier, it's a step too far, and actually the whole complaints system is a step too far.
Well, it was just very brief on that data point, actually. There isn't any kind of consistency across Scotland or public services on baseline data that we should be capturing. And I wonder to what degree, this is not about this ombudsman as such, but looking at other ombudsmen and what do they capture, measure and report on. So things aren't sitting in silos. And while what's necessary to do might be quite bare, this committee and others in the Parliament looking at what they expect to see, having the right process to capture data, have enough disaggregated data so you can scrutinise it further. I think it's really important, but I've done endless committees in this Parliament where the question of data does come up, wherever that is, whether it's public services themselves not capturing it. How on earth are you meant to deliver or advance a service that you're providing the public if you don't actually know what's going on? And having that publicly available at people's fingertips. And I think there's certainly something about what is necessary and good to have to be able to scrutinise. And there's a good reflection point here is these offices have been around for a while. At what point do you think about what does the future hold? How does it become fit for the future? and what do you need? And to Fiona's point there about who isn't getting in the system, how do you do that? But it can't. The others will be doing it really well. It's just not consistent.
So I actually think it's a deliberate ploy. I'm not being cynical, right? But we had the Cabinet Secretary for Education talking about we don't have data on number of bullying incidents, etc., when she actually had it because I provided all the data to her. Okay, they don't want the data, right? Because they know there's a massive underreporting problem with bullying in school. They know they're not dealing with it properly. They know there's weapon incidents, etc. I know, but they're not doing it. But basically, they don't want to collect the data. So and they don't go out and they certainly don't use the data when they have it as well, when they should be. So my point is that data is critical and it needs to be collected, but I don't think people want to collect it.
Thank you, Convener.
So I'm just going to, we've got a few more questions, a couple more members want to come in, and we've got about 20 minutes to manage that time. So just for awareness. And I'm going to go to Mark Griffin, who's joining us online.
Thanks, Convener. I want to come back to the point that Fiona just flagged, and I think Adam through Age Scotland's submission too, when we talk about barriers to accessing public services by groups such as BME carers, young carers, people with sensory impairments, people whose first language isn't English. So come to Adam and Fiona to talk about what those barriers are and what more can be done by the Ombudsman providing access to its services.
Thank you very much. I suppose in our response, we're looking at some of the common themes that come out, particularly from ethnic minority older people. We facilitate a fantastic forum called the Scottish Ethnic Minority Older People Forum, and regular discussions with them about how themselves and the communities that they represent feel about public services in Scotland, how they can access them or not. And I think there is certainly within them a generational issue. It could be skills in themselves, it could be digital exclusion. Knowing that there are organisations, or not knowing at all, I should really say, that are there to support them, access on language as well, which is a very difficult thing to do, but far from impossible. And also ensuring that they are supported with whatever kind of medical condition or disability they might have as well. So often that we kind of rely on a digital first approach to access to information, advice, or about our public services, but as I said earlier on, 500,000 over 50s in Scotland don't use the internet. Just because you have it doesn't mean you're particularly literate. There'll still be about a third of older people who are online but actually can't undertake the most basic functions, such as logging onto a web browser, changing a password is required. And so our metrics, and go back to data points, kind of tell a different story. But we do also know about the kind of institutional feelings that ethnic minority older people have with regard to public services, where they've had bad experiences in the past and just not feeling that they're there for them, that they don't feel that they're kind of shut out of this as well. So there will be institutional and historic reasons for that too. I suppose the challenge for services, charities, every organisation that's there to support people is not just to have the big flashing light on top of your building, physical or virtual, that you're here for everyone and you're inclusive, is how you're able to kind of demonstrate that. And it is challenging, but there's definitely issues we hear from people about. Literacy levels could be challenging, so just because there will be information in another language doesn't mean it's actually accessible. Are there advocacy services that are there for them, for translation and interpretation? These are all types of things which we've known for years, and I think Scotland's on a pretty good journey on this, but far from a complete picture. But there's definitely there with digital exclusion, just feeling like the service is there for you, and language barriers which exist here.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think our response reflected that. I think one of the most important things to enable people to access complaints and services as a whole is availability of advice and advocacy organisations to support people through that process. We know we're in very challenging times in terms of public funding. There's a danger of that shrinking back, and actually individuals' access to support and justice shrinking back as well. And I think it's very important to consider the impact of both time, which is something that carers are very time poor, but also the impact of income. That leads into digital access, but also leads into being able to access support at all, to be able to make complaints. So it's an issue that we all as organisations work through. But certainly when it comes to access to justice, it's critical that the Public Service Ombudsman does more, and public bodies as a whole.
Okay, Jan.
To endorse everything that my colleagues have just said from the Scottish Human Rights Commission's perspective. Access to justice in Scotland is a critical concern. It's one of the priorities in the Commission's 4-year strategic plan currently, and to help the Commission get a baseline for how access to justice is operating in Scotland, we've published a substantial piece of research led by Professor Katie Boyle from Strathclyde University last summer, and more recently in partnership with the Children and Young People's Commissioner, we've combined resources and published a map of human rights-based advocacy services in Scotland, and it's fair to say that in some cases there's a complete desert of provision. So I'd be very happy to share both of those pieces of evidence with the committee post this appearance, just to inform your own understanding.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that would be very welcome. Mark.
Yep, thanks, Camina. My other question I had was about previously the Ombudsman has spoken to committee about a change in legislation which would allow the SPSO to have their own initiative investigatory powers, allowing the SPSO to investigate public services without necessarily having the complaint first from a member of public, similar to what happens in Wales and Northern Ireland. So I just wanted to ask witnesses their views on that expansion of powers. Is that a good thing, or is it potentially a risk that adding another thing to the remit could lead to them being spread too thinly?
Fiona.
I think it absolutely should be expanded to enable that individual investigation, because the SPSO should not just be looking at individual complaints, but at the potential around systemic issues in a public service or a range of public services that needs to be considered and addressed and brought to the attention of the Scottish Parliament, because there may be indications that legislation or further activity is required. And I think it's got I feel that certainly it has the potential to be the canary in the coal mine where there are big issues emerging. And I think if you look at some of the instances but referring to some major inquiries that things that have led to major inquiries around residential learning disability support in England, and around some maternity services and where things have gone wrong. It's not a case that the individuals haven't raised complaints. It's not a case that in fact that the public, some of the public haven't been aware that some of these things have been going on. But the reality is there was not necessarily that oversight that there was a problem emerging. And I think if you provide those services, those powers to the Ombudsman, it gives us, I think, as a country, a greater reach into ensuring that the rights of individuals are being delivered, and poor practice and poor activity is not perpetrated and continued because the SPSO simply doesn't have the powers.
Okay, thank you. That was a good advocation for more powers, and I think that also came up earlier there.
I think in my case it's exactly right that I've uncovered this issue about the underreporting of bullying on a national basis, and the data proves that, and the fact that they can falsify records to cover this up and cover their tracks. For me, I would like the Ombudsman to have the powers to say, because I've been told this is going on across the country, not just I just happened to stumble across it, right? And I think they should have the powers in a situation like that to look and see if it is a nationwide problem. And if it is, they need to be able to do something about it. But currently they can't do that. So in my case, when they reopen it up, they're just going to look at, did they follow the correct procedure in my case? that's all it's going to be looked at. Which I do appreciate, by the way, that they're actually doing this.
Thanks, Jan.
Convener. Just in brief, again, I think endorsement there from the panel around the benefits of progressing with those powers. A general observation is that this appears to be a quirk of the lack of powers and teeth to the independent office holders in Parliament, of Parliament, who are discharged with the duties of upholding human rights through Scottish public service delivery. Those powers do exist for independent regulators in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and there is a gap, clearly, in respect of access to justice and seeing remedy, and it does have an impact on case law. We see a dearth of case law in all of the areas that we've explored today, and that could be remedied through a look again at the mandates of each of these office holders, and the opportunity for Parliament to do that is imminent through the forthcoming inquiry, which I know is still in the early stages of being set up. But it's an important moment to have the conversation, and I would encourage the committee to consider that.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm now going to... Oh, Peter, sorry, I didn't see you.
Can I very briefly just say that Horizon shouldn't happen in Scotland. We need to have an adequate and effective investigation so that people are not ignored, which they are being consistently ignored by various local authorities, etc.
Now I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. It's been a really interesting conversation so far. Jan, you've picked up on one of the questions I was going to ask surrounding the role of commissioners. So if anyone's got anything that would like to add about that, then please do. But one of the submissions that we received from the committee was regarding the Ombudsman and the public's complaint system as a whole, because we've heard a lot this morning about issues, concerns, accountability, processes and perception of the Ombudsman and public complaint system. But if we're looking at the rest of the UK and indeed throughout Europe, what would be an ideal best practice scenario that we could perhaps use here in Scotland that would improve things moving forward when we're looking at the Ombudsman as a whole? I don't know who would like to kick off with that. I know it's a huge question.
As far as I can see, we've got to simplify it. The best way to do it is to look at how something should be carried out, and then it allows measurement of the gap between how it should be carried out and the reality how it was carried out. This is the problem I had, is that I met with the Ombudsman and frankly they ran out of time, so I had engaged a computer expert. They weren't even interested in listening to how it should have been carried out, and the expert I engaged said, well, summarise your complaint in a sentence, and basically the sentence is Scottish Enterprise went live with a pilot scheme that was untested and incomplete, and we showed the Ombudsman in a 130-page report precisely where it was lacking. Frankly, I don't think any of them understood it. So we need to be able to actually demonstrate exactly how these things need to be measured, because otherwise it just becomes too complicated and people fall asleep. Which I hope they're not here, but
I think if the authority in their stage 2 response laid out what their obligations were, or the best practice or the process was for whatever it was, and how they met that, if that came back to someone like myself or anyone who could see what they were saying, if that made complete sense, or it was reasonable, or might not like it, but kind of like, if it was like you never picked them up bin for 2 weeks, but that's the process, you don't pick it up for 2 weeks, then in that case, they did what they should have done. And I think that would help. And then, of course, if the complainant's saying, well, actually, no, you never, you might have said that, but I disagree, when you then refer it on to the Ombudsman, they then have that moment, well, this is what the process, this is what the council say, or whoever it is, what it is, this is what they say they've done, this is what the complainant's saying. We'll check that against what we think it should be, and I think it'll be very quick. And I think in probably 98% of the cases, you could do that really quickly and really cost effectively. And probably you would reduce the number of complaints to them as well, because people would understand why the council or the authority did what they did. So I think stumbling down that end would be helpful.
So clarity.
Can I just... Sorry.
Fiona and then Jan have indicated they wanted to come in.
Yes, very, very briefly. I suppose that there's sort of two sides to it around process complaints and stuff that are about rights. And I'm very much in favour of the idea of frontline resolution. I think if you can take some of the confrontation and that adversarial side of it out of complaint system, I think that is always positive if you can find a solution together. But the current system, and I apologise, I know you asked about good practice, and I'm not really able to respond in relation to that, but I do think that we need to look at the legislation that we have passed, the things that we have signed up to and committed to around the UN conventions, and build a human rights-based system of complaints that looks at, have your rights been met? And if the answer is no, then there's a resolution at the end of that.
Thank you. Jan?
Absolutely. So everything that Fiona's just said, I really just wanted to return to ensuring that the Ombudsman has the powers it needs, and if you look at international best practice, there are some gaps. So we've already heard today about the power to raise own name investigations and inquiries, to compel information from public authorities as a result. That's a critical part of that. We think there's also something, and we've had this conversation with the Ombudsman herself, about creating the space and the opportunity through legislation to remove barriers to share information. So currently, if the Ombudsman is working with an individual and has uncovered a terrible violation of human rights, and I'm quite sure that they do, they are not permitted or able to share that information with bodies like the Commission, who may then wish to take forward further action in the public interest. And that is getting in the way of remedy and access to justice, and could well be something that could be remedied through a review of the legislation.
Okay, Adam, and then I'll come back to Peter.
Thanks. I think it's a really good question. I don't have, as Sarah said, the international best practice, but we do have, as Janet said earlier on, of other commissioners that exist across the rest of the UK that have sort of more extensive powers than that exist in Scotland. And I think if you're looking at this broader context of why we've had a proliferation of asks for things like commissioners on issues or for groups of people, it's because the public and civil society have felt that there's something missing in the Scottish landscape to meet these needs. But actually, it maybe boils down to as well how parliamentary committees have enough power to discharge the duties and the things and the scrutiny that you want as well, and whether or not we're in a position that, well, we're creating bodies, in other words, we're kind of scared of giving them too many powers for scrutiny because we don't like the answers. And actually, the answers could be really helpful in reforming the services that we have. So maybe the question is actually about why aren't we giving this, as opposed to should we do this, and actually start to have greater powers. So I do think, and I've been having discussions with members of the Scottish Parliament about, say, for instance, a commissioner for older people. Well, some of the feedback had been about, well, we wish the committees were stronger. We could be doing that kind of stuff. And I would absolutely agree. But the framework isn't there for that. And some of the commissioners that we have just been set up without the necessary tools to meet the challenges we face.
Just to be, or try and be brief, that's hard for me. One of the biggest problems I have come across is where a local authority or body under jurisdiction should have done something and hasn't done something. The Ombudsman never comes back and says, why didn't you do such and such? It's trying to prove the negative for a complainant is almost impossible. And the Ombudsman should be able to point this out and question the authority.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks. Just picking up on, Megan made a comment before she asked her about another question she had wanted to ask, and Jan, I think you spoke to it very well around the root and branch review, but just be interested to hear your thoughts around what we heard from our previous panel from Professor Gill and Mullen. They noted that there's, they made recommendations that England's former parliamentary ombudsman offices should be subject to 5 yearly independent peer reviews. And I just wondered what your thoughts are in terms of the parliamentary root and branch review of all commissioner offices in the next 6 months. What would you like to see this review achieve in terms of the SPSO? Let's keep it within that frame. Anybody got any thoughts on that in addition to what Jan already talked about? And that doesn't mean to say, Jan, you can't come back in again. Paul.
Famous two words, adequate and effective ombudsman. We need whatever, we have to ensure we have one, because they are really important, and we do need one, and they need more powers. So to me, it's to be sure that they are delivering adequately and effectively, and they've got the powers and wherewithal to do what they need to do.
Okay.
Because times move on.
Thanks very much. Anything to add? Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to agree, and also with the comment from Jan, but I think I agree this is the idea of that regular review and ensuring that the ombudsman has the powers that it needs to deliver trust and to deliver rights, and I think if you're something that isn't reviewed, then that I think that then becomes a problem.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, Peter.
Sorry, just one. Is Scotland big enough to find someone who can independently review the Ombudsman? Because Jim Martin had to go south of the border to get a retired Ombudsman when he wanted a report written.
All right, good question to consider there. So we've come to the end of our questions, and I just really want to appreciate all for coming in and sharing your perspective. And I think it has been a really interesting process for us this year, because we're taking a bit of a deeper approach rather than just hearing from the Ombudsman and based on their reports. I think it's been really helpful, enriching, and certainly hearing this sense of needing more powers to be able to fulfil the work that they're doing. I'm going to now briefly suspend to allow you to leave the room before we do our next piece of work. Thank you.
Just on that.
The next item on our agenda today is to consider the following SSI. Town and Country Planning Fees for Applications, Scotland Amendment Regulation 2024. As this is a negative instrument, there's no requirement for the committee to make any recommendations on it. Do members have any comments on the instrument? I think I've just got one comment, which is I think it's something that's come to committee before around the planning application fees. I think it's welcome that we can see our planning authorities maybe being able to recoup some of that costs with better reflected fees. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And we previously agreed to take the next item in private, so I now close the public part of the meeting.